Good evening, everyone. My name is Maya Locker, and I put together our programming here at the museum at Eldridge Street. Thank you so much for joining us for this special book talk with author Scott Seligman. We are going to have a Q&A at the very end of the program, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go, and I'd be happy to read them for you at the end. You'll also have the opportunity to unmute yourselves at the end and ask any questions out loud. For those that haven't visited us before, we are the museum at Eldridge Street, and we are housed in the historic Eldridge Street Synagogue, which was built in 1887. This grand building was nearly lost to neglect in the mid-20th century before a massive restoration project returned the space to its former glory and for public use, for programming, for educational offerings, and for daily tours. We tell the story of immigrant life. We explore cultural exchange and continuity, architecture, historic preservation, and you can find all of our public programming listed on our website, on our events calendar, and I'll post that link in the chat at the end of this introduction. We have some great virtual and in-person programming coming up. I'll just tell you about briefly. We have a ton of walking tours coming up. Almost every week, we have one or two walking tour offerings, so please check those out on our website. If you're not local, we have a ton of virtual programming as well. Coming up on February 19th, we have a virtual tour of historic Jewish Williamsburg. We also have an art history virtual program at the end of February, all about the Jewish connections of Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. You can check out all of our programming on our website, and again, I'll post that link in the chat momentarily. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening, Scott Seligman. Scott Seligman is a national award-winning writer and historian with a special interest in the history of hyphenated Americans. He is a former corporate executive who holds an undergraduate degree in American history from Princeton and a master's degree from Harvard. His first Jewish-themed book, The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902, won gold medals in history in the Independent Publisher Book Awards and Reader Views Literary Awards, and was a finalist in the 2020 National Jewish Book Awards. He lives in Washington, D.C. And with that, I will turn the screen over to Scott. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
My pleasure. This is actually, by my count, this is my third cooperation with the Eldridge Street Museum. The most recent one before this was a book. In 2023, we did a talk on murder in Manchuria, which was my book on the history of the Jewish community of Harbin, China. And earlier than that, as you mentioned, 2020 was the talk about the Great Kosher Meat War. I'm a narrative nonfiction writer, and as Maya said, I'm interested in hyphenated Americans. And so I've actually written 4 books on early Chinese Americans, 1 on African American history, and 2 now on Jewish American history, with 1 more on the way. So I'll talk for about 20, maybe 25 minutes, and then I'll be very happy to take your questions at the end. Now, sometimes I don't remember exactly when an idea for a book started to germinate for me, but I'm very, very clear on this one. This book actually got its start from the Kosher Meat book. And that was that came out in 1902, as I say. That was the story of uneducated immigrant Jewish housewives on the Lower East Side of New York who rose up to fight rising prices for kosher meat that actually put it out of the reach of many families. And so these women, their back was up against the wall. They couldn't serve their families non-kosher meat because of their religious beliefs, and they couldn't afford to buy kosher meat. And they took to the streets. And they ultimately triumphed over a very powerful vested corporate interests, and in the process discovered their collective consumer power. And that book, by the way, is already out in paperback, and as of last month is an audiobook as well. It's done very well because it's a very interesting story. And this book, well, actually, this book, one of the figures in this book was a man named Rabbi Jacob Joseph, or Jacob Joseph. He was involved in regulating the kosher meat business. He came to New York in 1888 to serve as, he came from Vilnius in what's now Lithuania, to serve as the chief rabbi of a couple of dozen Lower East Side Orthodox congregations, among them Kahal Adat Yeshurun, which is the congregation that was housed in the Eldridge Street Synagogue. And there was a late chapter in the Kosher Meat book that described the events that followed his death, which was just about 2 months after the Kosher Meat boycott. So I'm still writing about the same period. I included that chapter because I thought it was a compelling and very interesting story. But the truth is, the book could have done fine without it because it really happened a couple of months after the main action of the book. Well, when it came out, in December of 2020, Andrew Silo Carroll, which may be a name that's familiar to some of you, he's the editor of New York Jewish Week. He interviewed me and he wrote a column about the book and about the women who had led the boycott. And I was very happy with it and very surprised a week later when he wrote a follow-up column specifically about Rabbi Joseph. And he focused on what he called the astounding coda to Joseph's sad tale, which of course, by which he meant the riot that happened at his funeral. And that got me thinking. And I realized that the story of the riot at Rabbi Joseph's funeral really deserved a more fulsome retelling because it was a significant event in its own right. It deserved more than a chapter in a book about something else. It turned out it was the first time that the Jewish community really stood up for itself in a major way and got some concessions. And it set a pattern for the future. So I concluded that the story was important enough that, this is his second article. I concluded the story was important enough that it really deserved a book of its own. And so that's the genesis of the chief rabbi's funeral. The book actually tells three related stories. First, it's the story of Rabbi Joseph's 14 years in America. Second, how his funeral gave rise to what I believe is the single largest violent anti-Semitic incident that American Jews have ever suffered. And third, how in the wake of the funeral, the Jewish community organized and deployed its political clout, its newfound political clout, really, to pursue justice for the victims. Just before I do that, I'll tell you about the plot, though. Let me just give you a quick word about how I went about doing the research for the book. Much of the material came from newspaper accounts. Vintage newspapers are now available on the internet, and many of them are keyword searchable, which is a huge boon to researchers. We can now find items that we didn't know we were looking for, to put it bluntly. I was able to search, for example, all of the major New York newspapers, like the Times, the Herald, the Tribune, the Sun, the World, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. All of them are online, and not just online, but searchable. If you're as old as I am, you probably remember being hunched over a microfilm reader at a library someplace, hoping that you were searching the right newspaper at about the right time to find whatever it is that you were looking for. It was a very labor-intensive process, and you wound up missing a lot of things that would have really helped you in your research if you'd only known how and where to look for them. Well, keyword searching solves that problem. And you find things, if you put in keywords, you find articles in publications you never would have dreamed of searching. You find articles on dates that you wouldn't have thought of searching. And for a subject like Rabbi Joseph's funeral, and going through various websites, some of which are free, some of which are pay sites, I came up with several thousand articles before I was done. So in addition to, and that not just the New York papers, also papers from other towns and other cities, because this actually was a national news story. It wasn't just a New York story. Okay, in addition to that, several Jewish newspapers are preserved from the period in both English and Yiddish. And they give an important sort of the Jewish perspective on the events chronicled in the book. And not just the Jewish perspective, but Jewish perspectives, because a couple of the publications are socialist in orientation, and at least one was Orthodox in orientation. So you've got lots of different points of view about the events that were going on. If you're interested in that, the National Library of Israel has a wonderful collection of Jewish newspapers from around the world in various languages. It's got English, Yiddish, Hebrew, Ladino, German, French, Spanish, you name it, and you can search in all those languages. If you're looking for it, just Google historic Jewish newspapers and you'll find it. I also searched census records. I looked at ship passenger manifests. I looked at court records. I looked at passport applications. I read obituaries, which sometimes are the best way to find out about somebody's life. I even looked at gravestones. And all of this was in the service of trying to run down exactly who the characters were in the book and find out as much as I possibly could about them so I can make them three-dimensional in the book and not simply paper figures that you really didn't care about. I also looked at, of course, whatever secondary sources I could find, books like these. I looked for articles, some more reliable than others. Um, and uh, it's not as if historians are not aware of the funeral riot, but it does show up here and there in other works about the Lower East Side. But there's actually never been a book that's wholly devoted to it before this one. Okay, so Rabbi Joseph was brought to New York in 1888 by a couple of dozen Orthodox congregations on the Lower East Side of New York. They were basically Russian and Eastern European. They weren't German congregations. And it was led by the Beis HaMidrash HaGadol, which was the largest shul on the Lower East Side. It was on Norfolk Street. They had just lost their rabbi, so they wanted to bring in a new one, but they also thought that that there was a shot at making him the rabbi of the whole community as well. And so they actually gave him the title of the chief rabbi of New York, which was a misnomer. New York was far too large and the Jewish community was far too large, far too balkanized for all of its members to submit to the authority of any one rabbi, still less an Orthodox rabbi, because you had Reform congregations that already formed that were uptown. You also had Sephardic congregations that were Orthodox, but not particularly willing to submit to the authority of an Eastern European rabbi. And even on the Lower East Side, the majority of synagogues never were under the rabbi's aegis. But he came over with two hats, the rabbi of the Beis HaMidrash HaGadol and the, quote, chief rabbi of New York. This synagogue, by the way, stood until 2017. It was in horrible disrepair, but it was destroyed in a fire in 2017 that many people regard as suspicious. The principal reason they brought Rabbi Joseph over was to bring some order to the kosher meat industry, which was horribly, horribly corrupt at the turn of the century. A lot of Jewish consumers felt that they were paying for kosher meat, but what they were getting was not the real thing. And they had every good reason to believe that was true. In fact, in those days, there actually were butcher shops that dealt in both kosher and non-kosher meat. And since the price of kosher meat was higher, it was easy to do a little sleight of hand and sell something that in fact was not technically kosher, because nobody would really ever be the wiser. But there was a general sense in the community that there was too much corruption going on in the meat industry, and that was why they wanted to bring the rabbi over. It was the model that they used was the model from Eastern Europe and from Russia, the rabbi of the community. In most of those countries, the rabbi was an officer who was empowered by the state to manage the Jewish community, to discipline the Jewish community, to collect tax revenues from the Jewish community. And he was in charge of the shachtim, the slaughterers, and the mashgichim, the supervisors. And he could discipline them and he could fire them. In a couple of places, he could even order that they undergo corporal punishment if he was really mad at them. So the rabbi in Eastern Europe, the rabbi of the community, was a powerful position. But it didn't translate to America, where most of the Jewish community couldn't care less about Rabbi Joseph. It was only a couple of dozen, and then it grew to more than a couple of dozen. Initially, it was a couple of dozen congregations that ponied up the money to bring him over. And it was an expensive proposition. I think he got something like $2,500 a year, which was a king's ransom in those days. When a typical laborer on the East Side would bring home $10, maybe $12 a week, and that's all. Plus, he got a signing bonus because he had debts in Vilnius before he could come over, and they wouldn't let him leave until he paid over the debts. And they gave him a beautiful house with steam heat, which was a big deal in 1902. Excuse me, in 1888 when he first came over. So he was very well taken care of. There were two other areas that he was supposed to be active in. The second one was the Beis Din, or Bet Din, the religious court, to preside over disputes within the Jewish community and religious issues that people brought to him and to the others that he appointed. And then the third thing, which was probably the second most important after the kosher meat business, was education of young people. there was a concern in the community that the young people, especially the American-born people, the children of the immigrants essentially, were growing up fairly ignorant about Judaism. They certainly didn't have deep Jewish educations. They didn't go to cheder like they might have gone if they'd been in Eastern Europe. And some of them were actually being lost to either to Christianity or more likely to Reform Judaism, God forbid, in the eyes of some of these people. And so they thought that the rabbi would be able to inspire them to the traditions. In point of fact, in neither of these endeavors was he a success. He was a creature of the old world. He never learned English. He really didn't understand America. And he failed to connect with the American-born Jewish children who found him hopelessly out of date and very difficult to understand. And it wasn't just a matter of language, because most of them did speak Yiddish, which is what he would speak in, but they didn't speak his Yiddish. They didn't know the Yiddish associated with the religion and associated with the traditions and associated with the history of the Jewish people. They knew table Yiddish and in-home Yiddish and apartment Yiddish. And so there was a real disconnect between him and the young people. So once he came to great fanfare in 1888 for a 6-year term. And once the 6-year term was up, the congregations who had hired him didn't want to pay his salary anymore. They felt put upon. They were paying the rabbi to supervise the entire kosher meat business in the city, and a lot of people were benefiting, presumably, from what he was doing. But they were footing the entire bill, and they didn't want to do it anymore. So they allowed his contract to lapse. He went down to being a mashgiach, just a supervisor for a while. And then he had a series of strokes in the late 1890s that basically led him bedridden. And at the end of July in 1902, and right after the meat boycott was over, he finally died. But what happened then actually was truly remarkable. He'd been left destitute and forgotten. In fact, he really didn't have any money. At one point, they actually had to take up a collection for him, sort of a 1902 version of a GoFundMe, just to pay his family. But now that he was dead, those who had forsaken him, I can only assume they were guilt-ridden because of their callous treatment of him. They seemed intent on according him the honor in death that they had denied him in life. And no sooner had his death been announced that people flooded onto Henry Street, which is where his apartment was, to pray and to show their respect in front of his home. And that's when this picture was taken, the crowd in front of the rabbi's home on July 30th, the day of his death. So then the next question was the funeral arrangements. Once it became clear from these crowds that were showing up that no synagogue on the Lower East Side could possibly accommodate everyone who would want to be at Rabbi Joseph's funeral, the rabbis of these various congregations that were under his authority got together with the family, and they decided that they would borrow a different tradition from Eastern Europe, which had been used occasionally. There wouldn't be a formal funeral service at a synagogue. Instead, there would be a procession that would parade up and down the streets of the Lower East Side, and it would stop at the porticos of 6 of the congregations that he had supervised for prayers and for short eulogies. As it wended its way through the Lower East Side, finally going to Grand Street, at which point it was a straight shot down to the pier to board a ferry for Brooklyn ultimately for burial. And that was the plan. He was buried, by the way, in Cypress Hills. That's so he had to go. So the carriages were on the ferry, and then they would continue on once they got to the Brooklyn side. And the Lower East Side had never seen anything quite like Rabbi Joseph's funeral cortege. They had a squad of policemen who led the way, not very many of them, and certainly not enough, as it became clear, followed by 500 singing yeshiva buchers, who I guess you translate, I guess, as Hebrew school students, singing psalms. And then this is the hearse right in the middle of the picture there. And then somewhere between 200 and 500 carriages followed, carrying prominent rabbis, presidents of congregations, officers of Jewish groups, relatives and friends of the family. We don't know if it's 200 or 500 because the newspapers just disagreed on it. And they would actually have little signs on the sides of their carriage as to what organization they represented. They also had to wait an extra day. Typically Orthodox Jews try to bury people as soon as they can, sometimes the same day, more often the next day. This was actually 2 days after death because they wanted to wait for prominent rabbis from other cities who wanted to come in and honor him to be able to get to New York. So that's when this happened on July 30th. And this is a panoramic view of what the newspapers called the most remarkable funeral procession ever seen in New York streets. It wasn't. For non-Jews, they actually had bigger ones uptown sometimes, but for the Lower East Side, this was really quite something. The buggies were horse-drawn. The VIP buggies were followed on foot by an estimated 30,000 people, most of them congregants from nearly all of New York's East Side synagogues, including some that had not been under the rabbi's care. And that didn't count the crowds. The crowds that watched the procession from the windows, from the rooftops, from the front stoops, from the fire escapes, mostly Jews, but also curious Gentiles. They numbered somewhere between 100 and 300,000, according to the newspapers. So this was a big deal. And everything was fine and they were already on Grand Street heading for the ferry terminal when they crossed the intersection of Grand and Sheriff Streets. And that's where the Hoe and Company was huge, towered over the intersection. You can see it there in the center. The Hoe Company was, they were groundbreakers in the field of printing presses. They invented several printing technologies over the 100 or so years they've been around, including ones that made newspapers easy to print, cheap to print, and hence very affordable. So they were indirectly responsible for the development of the newspaper industry at the turn of the century. But they had a lot of immigrant workers, and they also had an internship program, I think they called it, an apprentice program, where they would take neighborhood kids, bring them in, teach them, educate them, not just about printing technology, but about school subjects as well. And if the boys were well behaved, and if they did their work and they passed their tests, they would be offered jobs in the factory. And so there was a whole coterie of young apprentices who worked there, as well as the senior people. And they unfortunately had a history of harassing Jewish passersby. They would pull the beards of the Orthodox men on their way to shul, or they would throw banana peels or apple cores down on passing Jews. It was basically childhood mischief. But nobody thought anything bad like that would possibly happen on a day like this. But sure enough, some factory workers from the upper floors of the factory started heckling the mourners with racial slurs from the safety of the upper floors of the factory. And then without warning, they started to throw things. First, it was cotton waste. It wasn't going to hurt anybody. Then it became blocks of wood and blocks of steel, iron bolts, bottles, bricks. And then torrents of hot water from the fire hoses started to rain down on the people. And if you can picture this, that intersection was so crowded with people that nobody could move. They were sitting ducks for whatever the factory people wanted to dish out. So there was no escaping. And they initially, first it was just confusion, but it soon morphed into anger. They actually sent a group into the factory office to try to get it stopped, but the officers of the factory on the first floor didn't understand what they were saying. They actually turned the hose on them, and so they were ejected from the factory. And so there was nothing to do for the crowd except to pick up the missiles that had been thrown at them and start throwing them back at the factory, which they did. And every single window on those two facades of the factory that you see, there were more than 100 of them, was broken before this was over. Well, Robert Hoe, who was the owner of the factory, was a descendant of the founder. He got panicky because the small party of police escorts that they had assigned to this cortege were completely unequal to the task of policing them. And so he picked up the phone, called the police, and asked for reinforcements. And he got reinforcements. Eventually they sent 8 patrol wagons from 5 nearby precincts, bearing 200 officers together. But by the time they actually got there, the violence had more or less subsided. But that didn't stop Inspector Cross. Adam Augustus Cross was a police inspector who had no love for Jews. He had a past. He had various tussles with Jewish people, and he actually made no effort to size up the situation or to distinguish the aggressors from the victims. He had a few words with Robert Hoe. He issued no warnings for people to disperse. All he did was order his men to, and this is a direct quote, club the life out of them. And his officers dutifully drew their billy clubs and they started beating up Jews. The New York Post wrote that, this is a quote, men were flung down, women were dragged out by the arms and shoulders and pushed headlong down the street. From the New York Herald, we get nightsticks were used without discrimination as to age, creed, or race. And the New York World reported that the police struck every man who looked like a Jew. The Forward, the Yiddish language socialist paper, did not mince words. It called it a bloody pogrom. Well, it wasn't exactly a Russian-style pogrom. Nobody died in it, for one thing. But it was inevitable that people who had been terrorized in the old country, not only by the peasants, but very often by the authorities in Russia, that they would make the connection. It was mass violence against a peaceful gathering of Jewish people. That's what it was. By the time it was all over, men with heads bleeding from the projectiles and the blows from the nightsticks were lying prostrate in the street, as were women and children who'd been trampled in the commotion. No fewer than 200 people were injured. A lot of them were with minor injuries were treated by the medics on site, but those with serious wounds were ferried to the hospital in these horse-drawn ambulances that you can see. Gouverneur Hospital, I think, is where they went. Those who were arrested, many of them still bleeding, were brought to Essex Market Police Court. And several prominent Jewish attorneys appeared out of nowhere to defend them. That, I think, was significant. The magistrate, John Mayo, he didn't even hear all the defendants out. He insisted that, and this is a quote, this spirit of lawlessness on the East Side should be discouraged. And lawless, and the East Side there was a stand-in word for Jews. And he lectured some and he fined others. Those who didn't have the means to pay, and the fines were something like $5 or $10. And remember, $10 was a week's pay. Those without means were held in jail, and several were held over for trial. Well, that evening, a dozen or so Jewish physicians, attorneys, and businessmen assembled to discuss how best to deal with the situation. They really had two goals. They wanted to achieve a full and fair investigation that would place the blame where it belonged, and they wanted to ensure that those who had attacked the Jews were brought to justice and that nobody be permitted to blame the victims or sweep the matter under the rug. In fact, by the evening, Robert Hoe and Inspector Cross had both already told the press that the Jews had come prepared to make trouble, which was preposterous. The Jews had come to see off their chief rabbi. Nobody came bearing weapons. What they threw back at the factory was what had been thrown at them. Among those assembled was a Polish-born criminal lawyer named Abraham Saracen. His father was a publisher of a couple of Yiddish language newspapers. And he would become one of the leaders of the effort to secure justice for the victims. And soon they set up an organization, they called it the East Side Vigilance League, to make sure that it came to pass. And one of the neat things about this, I'll get to Mayor Lowe in a minute. One of the neat things about the Vigilance League was that it was representative of almost the entire Jewish community of New York City. Typically, if the Russian Jews had a problem, the Russian Jews would solve it. The German Jews would hide under their desks and hope it all went away. But this was, the lawyers that came to defend these people were German and Russian. They were uptowners and downtowners. They were Reform Jews. They were Orthodox Jews. There had been an attack on the Jewish community, and it was no time for divisions within the community itself. You did not often see everybody banding together, but this was a case where they did. Well, one of the things that they wanted, as I say, was an investigation. And they actually had a friend in a high place who could help them. And that was not the case before. Seth Lowe had been elected mayor of New York City at the end of 1901 to serve a 2-year term, 1902 to 3. So he was the mayor at this point. He was unusually not a part of the Tammany Hall political machine. He was a reformer, and he was elected because he wasn't part of Tammany Hall, which frankly was responsible, among other things, for the corruption in the police department. He ran on a platform of cleaning up the police department. He only won by about 30,000 votes, but a lot of those 30,000 votes came from the Jewish community. They supported him. He knew it. They were great. He was grateful. They came to him for something that they wanted, and he was damned if he wasn't going to give it to them. Hoe himself he'd been the mayor of Brooklyn before. He'd also been the president of Columbia University. And all that time, he had been actually very helpful to the Jewish communities. He was at the openings of the YMCAs and the groundbreakings. And when he was at Columbia, he actually arranged that they didn't hold exams on the same days as the high holidays, so the Jewish kids wouldn't get penalized. He really was a friend to the Jewish community, and that's why they helped elect him. And one of the people he had appointed to clean up the police department was a guy named John Nelson Partridge. He was the new police commissioner. And so he was the first contact that the mayor made after he was asked to launch an investigation. He immediately dictated a letter to Commissioner Partridge, and he instructed him to give him a full report on what had happened. Unfortunately, what he did was exactly what the Jewish community didn't want him to do. He didn't know what had happened. He wasn't there. So he asked Inspector Cross to prepare the report. And sure enough, Inspector Cross included the fact that, as far as he was concerned, the Jews had started the whole thing. So he received that report. And even though the East Side Vigilance Committee provided the police with dozens of witnesses, but once that report came out from Inspector Cross, even after they persuaded the chief of police to assign it to somebody else other than Cross, it became very clear very quickly that the blue wall of silence was going to operate, and that the police department simply could not be trusted to police itself. So they went back to the mayor, and under additional pressure, he named a 5-man citizens committee, and including 2 well-established attorneys, Louis Marshall and Nathan Bijur, both of whom were Jews. And he gave them the mandate not only to investigate the riot, but he also told them that they were free to look at the broader picture of police abuse of the Jewish community if they wanted to. This was, we believe, the first citizens committee ever appointed to investigate an ethnic riot in the United States. And after it took weeks of testimony, it came to a final report, which was blistering. It not only exonerated the Jewish community, it also indicted the police and even the court system for discrimination against Jews. Literally, when they started taking testimony from people, they had to go through dozens of people who wanted to complain about things that had happened to them 5 years ago when they were mistreated by the police. The police, for example, they would go among the push carts, which were how a lot of very poor Jews made their money. And they would essentially hold them up for squeeze, for money. If you didn't have a permit to be on the street, you had to pay the police a certain amount of money. Even if you did have a permit, you had to, or they would be all over you. So this was the kind of police corruption that the Jews had to put up with. Plus, as low people on the totem pole, because the police were predominantly Irish. They weren't all Irish, but probably about 50% of them were. They saw the Jews as much lower in status than they were. And they had recently been lower in status than anybody else when they first came. The Protestant establishment wasn't very nice to the Irish, and the Irish gave that back to the Jews. So there were lots and lots of stories about horrible behavior on the part of the police that came before this committee and that they had to consider when they were actually writing the final report. Well, I'm not going to go into the details of what happened right after that, but before it was all over, the Jewish community had actually forced 5 distinct investigations. The one within the police department that nobody trusted, the one by the Citizens Committee that was pretty trustworthy, one by the district attorney who eventually brought some charges, and then 2 by committees that the Jewish community had set up by itself. And they resulted in disciplinary hearings, three police disciplinary hearings, half a dozen accelerated retirements of people out of the department, several transfers out of the Lower East Side, the resignation of Commissioner Partridge and his deputy, who was particularly loathed by the Jewish community. 2 officers and a handful of Hoe employees were tried for assault, even though none was ultimately punished. And even the city magistrates were chastised. The mayor warned them publicly that their prejudice against the Jews had actually permitted the police to take far too much license in how they carried out their responsibilities vis-a-vis the Jewish community. So in 1902, New York's Jewish community found that by uniting and organizing and building alliances, it could hold the government accountable for taking to task the people who did it harm. And in the more than century since then, organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, all of which were established in the wake of this 1902 riot within a decade or so, they've done more or less the same thing after incidents like the murder of the 11 worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Now they're working to counter the anti-Semitic violence that we see on the campuses. And as they seek to leverage their political influence to combat discrimination and to secure justice, they've in effect borrowed a page from the East Side Vigilance League's playbook. When people talk about anti-Semitism, even racism in general, it's often accompanied with a wringing of hands. They say it's always been with us. They predict it always will be. I'm not in a position to argue with that. Eradicating it may well not be possible, but at very least, we can impose a significant and a deterrent cost on it when it rears its head in violent expression. And in 1902, the Jewish community in New York showed us how to do that. Well, let me unshare my screen now. And if you have questions, I would be very happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Scott. And we're going to give it a little bit of time for folks to either put their questions in the chat, or we'll also give you an opportunity to unmute yourselves. But I have a few in my direct messages already, and folks are welcome to direct message me as well if you would not like them to appear publicly. But we have a question about why you think this very crucial event clearly was forgotten.
This wasn't the only one that was forgotten. The Great Kosher Meat War was forgotten too. I didn't find any references to that event, which was a seminal event, I believe. After about 1920, there were no more references to it until a scholar at Yale University, the late Dr. Paula Hyman, exhumed the story from history and wrote about it in a journal. This particular event's known by historians, but it's not widely known. And I think for various reasons, I suspected, well, for one thing, it was a flash in the pan in a way. This was over in 2 months. The whole thing, the reports were all in, and people moved on. So it didn't. I would argue that it in itself didn't stay in people's minds. But what did were the tactics that the kosher meat women used to organize the community to demonstrate. In this case, the tactics that the newly powerful Jewish community was able to use to bring the government behind them to try to get a measure of justice. What I may not have mentioned as I was doing the talk was that the reason that this worked in 1902 and it hadn't worked before was population growth. There were so many Jews coming into the United States. And this was these were the peak immigration years, the first several years of the 20th century. And then within 5 years, you could become a citizen. And if you were a citizen, you, of course, could be a voter. It was a 5-year process. The first year, I think you had to file your declaration of intent, and you had to be here 5 years before you could be a citizen. But ironically, it was Tammany Hall that was making sure that the Jews were registering, because the more voters they had, the more they could stay in power. So what had been impossible before became possible. I found a case in the late 1890s where some Jewish laborers were on strike, and the police came in, they started beating up heads. And even though they had a permit to demonstrate, didn't matter. And so they lodged a complaint against the police, and the police dutifully opened up an investigation. And the Jews came to testify in front of this particular inspector that they had designated to run the investigation. And he actually said to them, "You may as well go home. I will not believe a Jew under oath." So this was what they had before this. And what changed magically was all of a sudden they had some political clout because they'd elected the mayor. They'd been instrumental in his election. Why it wasn't mentioned, why it wasn't remembered, a lot of this stuff just faded into history. In fact, with both this and the kosher meat book, I did some tracing of family trees because I wanted to get to the descendants of people to see if I could get some stories and some photographs that I could use in the book. And to a person, nobody knew about their ancestors' activities in either of these events. I was actually telling them more that I knew than they knew about what had happened. So I don't have a great reason for why. I just suspect that it was a flash in the pan and it was forgotten. And people moved on and they remembered other things. They remembered the Kishinev pogrom, which was bigger, and some of the other things that happened during that period.
Thank you so much. And then we have another question. How did the aftermath of the riots and Seth Lowe's efforts to seek justice affect his political fortunes and career?
He wasn't reelected. I'm not sure that's why he wasn't reelected. The truth is, I doubt it was why he wasn't reelected, because the newspapers were all very, very supportive of the Jews. You didn't see people lining up behind the preposterous stories of Robert Hoe and Inspector Cross. No, it didn't pass the smell test that all these people came to a funeral armed with projectiles to go after a factory. And nobody believed it. And also, there was widespread understanding that the police were highly corrupt and that they were, it was very difficult to deal with them, that they were the law, they were the authority. If they wanted to beat your heads in, nobody would really stop them. So the police were not popular at this point at all.
And talking about the factory workers, we have another question if the attackers from the factory were charged as well.
A few of them were, nobody was convicted. Interestingly enough, a lot of the literature that followed this assumed that the factory workers, like the police, were mostly Irish. And there's a professor up at Holy Cross who put that in particular myth to bed. We don't have rosters of who worked for the Hoe factory. But what we do have are the names of the people who were arrested, the factory workers who were arrested, anyone who testified. We've got all the names. Some of them were obviously German names, German sounding names. And for all of them, I actually went back to the census records to see where these people had came from, or where they had come from, or where their parents had come from. And actually, the ones we could identify were mostly Germans rather than Irish.
Interesting, considering the population of Lower East Side was at the time. I mean, obviously, it was predominantly Jews at the time, but it was
Yeah.
very
But,
diverse, like it is
and they
today.
had also displaced people. You know, the Jewish community was growing by leaps and bounds, and other people had lived on the Lower East Side. It was the place of first where the people who first landed stayed for a while, and it was certainly wasn't just Jewish. The Chinese were there. There were a lot of African Americans there, and the Italians were there. There are lots of ethnic groups that were there at the time. And because the Jews were among the newcomers, they were the new kids on the block. They got hazed, just like new kids on the block always do.
And talking about before you mentioned the kosher meat war as well, another kind of semi-forgotten moment in history when it comes to activism in the neighborhood. This was the same year as the kosher meat war, and we have a question about what that tells us about this time of activism in general, if anything.
Well, it was a time of tremendous change. And it was a time, I guess you could argue that the commonality between these two things is that the Jews were feeling their oats. All of a sudden, they either had or intended to develop power centers of their own. In the case of the poor women on the Lower East Side, there was nobody that was looking out for them, so they looked out for themselves by demonstrating in the streets. In this case, it was they finally had friends in the firmament. You know, by 1902, the representative in Congress from the Lower East Side was a Jew. So they were already beginning to elect Jewish officials. Even Tammany Hall had empowered some Jewish people. They knew they couldn't get away with ignoring them and still count on Jewish votes. So the Jews were really working their way into the political firmament, and they were using it. And using it, I think, and I think they were using it deftly. They didn't overdo it. At one point, after the police investigation was such a bomb, when they went back to the mayor and they demanded a citizen's investigation, there were some articles in the uptown German Jewish press about saying, why are you doing this? The mayor is on our side. Why are you putting more pressure on him? This is the wrong thing to do. And in fact, the mayor didn't take umbrage. He understood what political pressure was. He was a politician. But they were trying to figure out exactly how to use it. Another point I think that's relevant to this. Up until this point, every time there was a problem for the Jewish community, they would set up an ad hoc group to deal with it. This was the East Side Vigilance League. They had a ladies anti-kosher meat, I forget the exact name of it, anti-meat producers group. They would set up a group to kind of run the whole show. And then as soon as the problem was over, it would fall right back into obscurity. It would die. And it was not too long after this, but it was 1906 actually, in response to a statement by a later chief of police that Jews were responsible for an overwhelming number of crimes in New York City, which they were not. It was an absolute lie. Once that happened, they realized they needed an ongoing committee that was not going to be ad hoc, that was going to look out for the interests of the Jewish community. And they set up something called the New York Kehillah, which only lasted 10, 15 years before it collapsed of its own weight. But it was the first effort to set up an umbrella organization that would represent Jews of various stripes and wouldn't go out of business as soon as the problem was solved. Its successors on the national level were the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Committee, which are still with us today.
Thank you. And we have another question about police oversight in general. They ask, given the effectiveness of the civic response to this injustice, how do you account for it taking until the 90s for a civilian task force to investigate police overreach? Which is interesting.
I don't even know when like police review boards actually became popular, when they were even talked about. But I don't have an answer for that. I didn't really study that. I don't know why it took till the 90s, but I will say this. Things got better after this. There was never a repeat of this. And there were large funerals on the Lower East Side. Shalom Aleichem died not too long after this. But the police sent enough people out this time to make sure that there wasn't any problem, and there wasn't. So there was a process of professionalizing the police department that started it started in the 1890s under Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt. He started to reform the department, and over the years they would develop police manuals and things like that to try to reform and file off the worst abuses that the police were bringing down on people. But I don't have an answer for why it took till the 90s for civilian review boards. I can't answer it.
It seems like it was mostly a case-by-case basis back in the day.
Yeah.
And you mentioned at the beginning that there was just this one chief rabbi kind of in the history of New York. Someone did ask if there was a new rabbi who took over the position, but maybe the position of the rabbi at that congregation. And what do you feel about not having another chief rabbi since? What was that like?
Yeah, well, the truth is, the rabbi became so unpopular. And one of the reasons he became unpopular was that one of his solutions to the kosher meat problem was to designate the meat that had been slaughtered under the supervision of his own supervisors that he had hired. They put a little seal on it, like on a chicken leg or on a piece of beef. It was called a plumba in Yiddish, and it was lead. I don't think they would use lead today if they were doing it. But the seal was your insurance policy if you were a consumer, that this was kosher under the authority of the rabbi. And not only that, it also told you when the meat had been slaughtered, so you'd know how long you had to soak it and salt it so you could serve it to your family as kosher. The problem was that cost money. And in order to, and so did paying the supervisors. And so in order to do that, they charged a penny a chicken in addition to what the people were paying. And this was a huge problem because the consumers didn't see it as a fee for service. They saw it as a tax. And they saw it as a tax that was paying the rabbi's cronies. So he became very unpopular. At one point, I think it was the Hungarian community, it may have been another one, they appointed their own chief rabbi so they wouldn't have to go through Rabbi Joseph. And there was a hysterical article in one of the Jewish newspapers where he was interviewed and said, well, who actually named you chief rabbi? And his answer was the sign painter, the guy who painted the sign on my office. He's why I'm a chief rabbi. There was some anemic talk after he died of replacing him as chief rabbi, but there was no appetite for it. First of all, he technically was no longer chief rabbi when he died, even though that was conveniently forgotten for the purposes of the funeral. He had ended his contract as chief rabbi. He wasn't chief rabbi anyway. And it had not been a success, this experiment. This importation of the model from Europe didn't work in New York City, which was too big, too balkanized, too diverse. And so there really was very, very little enthusiasm at this point for doing it again. And so there really never was another chief rabbi of New York. He was the first, and he was really the only.
And why do you think that the model still did work everywhere else in the world? And to this day, most other places in the world do have a chief rabbi, but why is the
Well,
US
London does, or
London
did.
does?
I imagine it still does. One of the differences was that he had the support of the government.
Mm,
And we have this system that may be ending soon where the government doesn't mess in religion and religion doesn't mess in the government. And so he had no authority to enforce any of his decrees. The only way he could get people to go along with what he said was through persuasion.
mhm.
And that didn't often work, or didn't always work anyway. It simply wasn't adapted to life in America, and it couldn't work. And I think they saw that. They saw it actually even before he died.
And we had some questions about his burial site. What do people visit his burial site today?
Oh,
What is his
yes.
legacy today?
Yes, in fact, I showed a picture of his grave with a
Mhm.
modern marker. That doesn't date to his death. There was a lot of the problem was he died without specifying where he wanted to be buried, and this was a big problem. It's one of the reasons that I think it took an extra day to decide where they were going to bury him, and that they were going to hold the funeral. They had to caucus with the family. It was the family and the various rabbis of the synagogues that had worked with him that got together, and what it boiled down to was a bidding war. It was where was he going to be buried? Well, it depended on who owned the property and who was going to pony up enough money to provide a pension for his wife for the rest of her life. And it was in the end the Beis Hamidrash Hagadol who ponied up the money. They got pride of place, so he was buried in their part of the cemetery. And they paid a lot of money to his wife to get this to happen. But as it turned out, it was in fact a good investment, because no sooner had they designated the property that people started bidding on the adjacent properties, and they wound up making more money from those bids than they were spending to fund his wife for the rest of her life. So that was it. Was that answer the question? The question was where he was buried,
Yeah.
right?
Where
Yeah,
he's buried
people
and
do.
about his legacy. Yeah.
Yes. There was shortly after he died, there was a school named for him. It's still going on, the Jacob Joseph School. People do visit his grave. He was an important rabbi. He was a Talmudist. His nickname in Europe was Yankel Charef, which was Jacob the Sharp, because he was so bright. He was encyclopedic in his knowledge of Jewish law. The problem was he didn't speak English, and he didn't really understand America. But as far as just being a rabbi was concerned, he's still revered in the Orthodox community. And somebody, I don't know who, spent a lot of money on a new gravestone for him that covers his entire grave. It's beautiful.
Yeah. All right. I'd like to open it up now for anyone who'd like to ask any questions out loud. You're welcome to raise your hand, either physically or by using the reaction button. Would anyone like to ask out loud? If not, no worries. We can stick to the chat. The cold is making everybody shy tonight. We do have some thank yous in the chat, Scott. Thank you for such an
Oh,
insightful presentation. Thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoyed. We do have another comment in the chat, more about this concept of the chief rabbi, that the rabbi was hired by a group of congregants at the time to be chief rabbi. So
right.
this really was a job. It wasn't, like you mentioned, it's not a government position. This was a position kind of like being the rabbi of a congregation, but bigger at the time.
I'd say it again. I didn't quite understand the question.
We have a comment saying that he was hired by a group of
Right,
congregants at a time when there were hundreds of congregations in New York City.
right,
He was kind of hired to represent people who hadn't just chosen to hire him, right? Which is what you mentioned, this kind of area of contention was where he was kind of trying to execute authority over people that maybe
right,
didn't accept his
right,
authority.
right, right. Well, that's right. But uh, let me put it this way: if they really didn't want him to exercise authority, he had no authority over them. The case in point was the Sephardic congregations uptown. They were equally orthodox in their own tradition. They were perfectly happy for some order to be brought to the kosher meat business, and I think they took advantage of that. They were perfectly happy with the fact that there was a chief rabbi for those other Jews who lived downtown. But they didn't have any particular reason to put themselves under his authority, and they wouldn't do it. So I think if there had been any dissent in any of these constituent synagogues about Rabbi Joseph's authority, probably they would not have continued to participate if there had been any serious dissent. It was the leadership of these various synagogues that decided we're going to place our synagogues under his authority.
And we have a question about any relatives living today. And I would follow that up with if you've spoken to any of his relatives, if he has then.
I have not. I believe that there are relatives. His son, actually, I've forgotten specifically. His son was a city official, I think.
Actually, we have a
And
comment in the chat that his grandson became the controller of the city in
his
1940.
grandson,
So maybe, yeah,
his
maybe
grandson.
it's
It wasn't
him.
his son. That's right. That's right. So there was, the story didn't end with his ignominious departure. There are relatives, and I believe there are relatives living today as well. I didn't speak with them.
And I think in our last minute, I'd love for you to just tell everyone what more folks can discover in the book.
What more to discover in the book?
I'm sure you couldn't cover the whole book this evening.
Yeah, well, I thought the way the court cases proceeded was sort of interesting. It was also a little bit disappointing. Nobody really got more than a rap on the knuckles at the end of the day. Um, and but all in all, I think it's still a victory for the Jewish community because they got the attention that they wanted. Um, they learned how to use their authority and their political clout. I would also, nobody's asked me today, and I'm grateful that nobody has, about how I would relate this to what's going on the campuses today. I'm not really I'm not an expert on what's going on today. I just read the papers like you do. But I would say that the lessons of this, anti-Semitism has been here before there was a United States. It's going to be here after we're all gone. It expresses itself in very different ways in some cases in different generations. And there are many different reasons given for it and many different excuses given for it. We should always try to use education to combat it. That's what the ADL does. But I think that the lesson also of the 1902 riot is that when it morphs into intimidation and when it morphs into violence against Jews, it crosses a line. And then our best response as a Jewish community is to unify and to organize and to use whatever political power and influence we've been able to assemble with the authorities to make sure that it's punished so that it's less likely to occur. So let me leave it at that.
And that's a great message to end with. And everyone in their confirmation for the program got a discount code to purchase the book. So if you want to check it out, you can do it there. You can also do it if you come visit the museum. It's in our gift shop along with the kosher meat book. So definitely check that out. Thank you so much, Scott, for what
A
did you say?
pleasure.
Your seventh talk with us?
No. I think it's my third,
Oh,
but
your third. Okay.
I'm hoping there will be a fourth. I have another book coming out at the end of this year, and Maya, you'll hear from me again.
Can you give us a teaser? What's it about?
All right, I'll give you a teaser.
All right.
The working title is The Great Christmas Boycott of 1906.
Oh.
It takes place 4 years after all of this. It's still in New York, but it's not on the Lower East Side anymore. This is Brooklyn. And it's about the Jewish community's efforts to to essentially banish Christianity from the public schools in the form of Christmas pageants, Bible readings, all of this kind of thing. They did not have market success in this. what had been an argument between the Protestants and the Catholics in the 19th century, the Jews jumped in with both feet in the 20th century. And it's the story of actually the Orthodox Union, a particular a staff member at the Orthodox Union who was put himself front and center to try to get this thing changed. So watch for it. Should be coming out at the end of this
Definitely.
year.
You're on an activism streak here.
Yeah, well, and also I'm looking for new topics. If you have any idea, by all means, write me. My website is seligmanonline.com. And if you have
Well,
any
that's a
thoughts
good
about
comment for
what else I
anyone
might
else who
write
has any
about,
questions. Anyone else who has any questions for Scott, you can check him out there on his website. Thank you so much. Everyone stay warm, no matter where you are, and we'll see you in our next program. Thank you so much, everyone.
thanks a
Thank you,
lot.
Scott. Good night.